When you create a Docker image, that image is going to be immutable, which means that it's not going to change over time. Imagine a situation where you want to keep some data that the application produces. For example, you may have a situation where you want to keep multiple XML files and then share it across multiple containers. How can you do that? Maybe you have a situation where you want to keep a database file and then share that database file across multiple containers, so that when the application running inside the containers makes some changes into that database file, all the containers see that change. So how can you implement such a system using containers? One way to do that is using a method called bind mount. In the case of bind mount, you can bind or mount a random folder in the container host inside the container. So in the next demo, what we are going to do is to see how you can do a bind mount and then mount a random folder inside the container host inside the container. I'm in my lab machine where I have started 2 command line as an administrator. To see how this bind mount works, what I'm going to do is to bring up the Windows File Explorer in the container host and then create a folder called data. So let me bring up this. So this is inside the container host, which I'm going to create a folder called data. So once I created that, in the command line on my left hand side, I'm going to start a new container. And in this case, I'm going to mount a volume, and to do that, I'm going to say -v, and I give the source of that mount location, which in this case C data, and I want to mount it inside the container as C, let's say my data. And I'm of course going to run the Windows server core image, and inside that, let's say I'm going to run command line. So once you type enter, the container will start. So I'm now inside the container, and you can see that my data folder is inside the container that I just started. So it's available as a link. Let me start another container in the second command prompt. So same like before, I'm going to say docker run interactively, and I'm going to mount the same folder C data in the second container as, let's say, C my data. You can give it a different name if you like. It doesn't need to be the same name. And also you can mount the same source folder across multiple containers. So I'm going to run Windows Server Core Image, and I'm going to run command line. So if you type dir, you will find that my data folder is available as a mounted folder. And if you type hostname, you get this container ID, and if you type hostname, you get another container ID in the first container. And if you go into the data folder, let's go into that and then see, as of now, there's no files inside that. So let's go inside that data folder. In the second container also, I'm go inside the data folder. Let's clear the screen and then see, do a bit of cleanup. As of now, there's no files inside. So let me create a new file. You can give it like something like sample data. And once you create it, let's say hello world inside that file. If you type dir, you can find that file sample data is available on the first container. And if you type dir, it's available on the second container. Containers also can create files inside this mounted folder. For example, from being inside the container, let's say I'm going to create a file called, let's say, con1.txt. And of course, the container one can write into that file, and you can find that that file got created inside the shared folder. And that file is, of course, has the content that I wrote. And this file is also visible in the container too. The other approach to share data or configuration across multiple containers is by using this concept called volumes. The difference between volumes and bind mount is that a volume in Docker world is managed by the Docker itself. So rather than just mounting a random file location, when you create a volume and then share it across multiple containers, that volume is managed by the Docker itself. Let's now go for a demo and then see how to do volume mounting. I'm in my container host where I have started a command line as a administrator. So let me go into a special folder in the container host that's under C program data Docker, and inside that you have some folder called volumes. So do not modify this. This is completely managed by Docker through volume commands. But I have opened this folder just to show you what happens behind the scene when you create volumes. You can get help about volume command by typing docker volume and -- help. You can find there are multiple things you can do with volumes. You can create a one, inspect one, list or remove a volume. So just observe this folder when I create a volume. So to create a volume, I'm going to type docker volume create and give a name for that volume. So in this case, I'm going to name it like let's say my data. When you press enter, you can find that it created a folder in this special folder. So this folder is managed by Docker. You are not supposed to go there and then manually modify it. So like before, I can now start a container and then mount this volume inside that container. So if you type docker volume, you can find that I have one volume called my data. So here what I did was I list down the volumes. So to do that, you type docker volume ls. So if I start a container, let's say I'm going to run it interactively, I can mount that volume by typing -v, name of the volume. So in this case, my data, and I want to mount it inside ctemp. Alternative, you can give it a different name, let's say temp2. And I'm going to run the famous Microsoft image, Microsoft Windows Server Core. And inside that, let's say we run PowerShell. So when I type enter, it's going to start a container and then mount that volume inside this container. So if you type dir, you can find that temp2 is available as a folder inside that container. So let's go to that temp2 folder, and if you type dir, you can find there's no file. If you explore this folder, you can find that there's no any file created. So being inside this temp2 folder inside the container, let me create a file. Let's say mytext.txt. And when I create that, you can find that file got created inside that special folder and the content is same. So what's the advantage of having this volume is the next question. Of course, I already told you that this volume is used by containers and is managed by Docker. So what I'm going to do now is to start another command line and then showcase you what's the advantage of having these volumes. So if you type hostname, you can find this container is running and it's using this volume. If I start another command line and then let's say I'm going to remove this volume. So if you type docker volume ls, you can find that I have this volume called my data. To remove a volume, you type docker volume remove and name of the volume my data. You can find that the Docker gave an error saying that this volume is used by a container that is already available in the machine. So obviously, when a container is referring to this volume, you cannot remove it. So this is a good way to manage your volumes. Let's try to, so right now there's a running container that is referring to that. Let's try to exit from this container. So if you type docker ps -a, you will find an exited container. if you try to remove the my data volume again, it will give you an error saying that there's a container still referring to this volume. So only when you remove the container completely, so in this case Docker remove the container ID, that you can remove this container, this volume. So if you type docker volume remove my data, now you can find that there's no any volume. So if you type docker volume list, you will find that the volume is gone. So this is the proper way to manage volume. You create a volume with docker command and you manage it with docker command. If there's any containers referring to that, the Docker will not remove the volumes. Let's try to understand the difference between volume mount and bind mount using the diagram. So here you have a container host. Of course, inside the container host, you will have a file system. So this can be your C drive, your D drive with some folder structure in place. And inside the container host, you are going to run a container. So when you run a container, you can mount some random folder inside the file system using bind mount. So we already observed how this works. So this may be something inside your Windows folder, you are inside your D drive that you are going to mount. But in the case of a volume mount, you are going to create a volume using some Docker commands, and that will of course create some special folder in the file system, but that folder is managed by the Docker. So you're not going to manually manage that. So Docker knows which containers refer to that, and if you try to remove that using Docker command, it will complain that hey, you first need to remove the containers prior to removing the volume. Then there are some additional mounting that you can do. That mounting system is called temporary mounting, where you mount into the memory. But in the case of Windows Container World, you usually use bind mount and volume mount. So we will not explore how to mount into the memory using this temporary mounting mechanism.